on our weekend services and our morning service. I hope that's okay, but since nobody can talk back to me at this point, I'm just going to do it. So I hope that works out just fine. Today what I want to do is I want to start out with another devotional from the events that immediately followed the death of Jesus, since that's where we left him on Sunday. And then at the end of our time together, I want to wrap up with a little bit of an explanation on what we've decided as a leadership team we want to do this month about communion. So 2 parts, devotional, and then a quick announcement at the end. But let me start with this kind of meditation and thoughts on the events that immediately follow the death of Jesus. On Sunday, as you may recall, I hope you do, we spent a few minutes with Jesus reflecting on his time that he spent on the cross. And what we did is we looked at his final words to see if we could gain any insight into what was going on in his mind and in his heart in his final moments of his life here on earth. And what I suggested to you is that there were a few things that we definitely know were on his mind. One were his loved ones, okay? And his loved ones, surprisingly enough, included his enemies, right? He prayed that God would forgive his enemies, for they don't know what they do. He's actually trying to defend them from the wrath of his Father. But he also remembered a stranger who did a nice thing for him, who defended him in front of the people that were mocking him, another criminal who was dying right next to him, and he promised him and assured him he'd be with him that day in paradise. And then we also remember that he, from the cross itself, saw his mother weeping and grieving at basically right by his feet, and made sure that she was well taken care of. So Jesus was thinking about other people all the way up till his final moments on this earth. But then we noticed there was a shift to thinking about the sufferings that he was enduring. And his physical sufferings were significant, right? I mean, like, we've seen the movies, we've seen the depictions. You may have heard some of the descriptions of crucifixion and the flogging and the beatings that happened. And his physical sufferings were significant, no doubt about it. But what Matthew and Mark especially emphasize is the spiritual suffering that Jesus is experiencing from about noon till 3 p.m. as the lights have gone out, there's some kind of solar eclipse or something, and it's completely dark, and during that 3 hours of darkness, Jesus is on the cross, and at the end of that 3 hours, he screams out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In those hours on the cross of darkness, his Father has abandoned him because he's bearing the sins of the world in his body, and he's paying for those sins. He is suffering the wrath of his Father over those sins that we had committed. Now, sometime after that 3 hours is up, there's another shift, and Jesus focuses now on his victory, the victory he had accomplished by his death or by his sacrifice on the cross, over sin and over death and over hell and over Satan. Remember, he cries out from the cross, "It is finished." And that's the celebration we all get to have, to know that now a new world has come to being. A world in which sinners like us can be truly forgiven for the sins that we've committed. The work Jesus came to do was done. And then, of course, he wraps up his life almost like a child, praying right before he goes to sleep. And once again, addressing his Father as Father, he says, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." He was looking forward to going home. So it's a beautiful insight into Jesus' heart and what is going on. And it's kind of funny because that final statement he makes is almost a very gentle, calm, quiet moment in the middle of what has been a very dramatic and very upsetting and disturbing, and in some cases incredibly horrific experience he's been on ever since he was arrested, the trials, dragging his cross through the streets of Jerusalem, being nailed and then hanging on the cross until he died. That was all very dramatic. But here he is at the very end, and at the very end, it's almost like kind of calmed down again, a little bit of quiet. And then, of course, all the craziness just happens all at once. He breathes his last. Let me just show you from the text what I'm talking about. And then what I want to do for the next couple minutes is take a look at the incredibly dramatic events that followed his death. That last breath when his spirit leaves his body to return to his Father, at that moment, a lot of things happen simultaneously on earth that signify that what just happened was possibly the most significant event the world has ever seen. And anybody who was around Jerusalem that day could see these things happen and know that something crazy and really important had just happened. So let me read the text, and then we'll talk a little bit about it before we reflect. We switch gears a little bit. So Matthew chapter 27 is where I'm going to be today. Matthew 27, and I'm going to start reading in verse 50. It says this, "And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit." And then the text says this, verse 51. "And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. And the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, 'Truly, this was the Son of God.'" Now, that's pretty dramatic. That's pretty eye-opening. That is something I guarantee you that if you experience those events, you would not forget about them probably for the rest of your life. And probably for weeks and even months, those events would be burned onto your brain. This gets everybody's attention. Now, the funny thing, I mentioned this to you before, I think it was last week, is that by and large, Jesus' ministry was not a ministry that tried to attract attention to itself. In fact, even when Jesus does like a miracle, like he heals somebody, he often tells them not to tell people about it. Kind of keep this private between you and God and you and the closest people that are in your life. Don't go talking too much about it. Jesus seemed to be a little bit suspicious of miracles in the sense that they draw a following, but they don't really create faith and the kind of commitment and devotion that he was looking for. So Jesus is all the time downplaying the miracle, downplaying the drama, and he's focusing on the message, and he's trying to challenge people. This is something that's going to require the rest of your life. This isn't something that you just get excited about and come and watch and view and ooh and ah as an entertainment thing. This is a life change that is going to radically change your life. So that's where his emphasis is. And oftentimes, he tries to kind of fly under the radar. Well, we mentioned that at the triumphal entry, that all changes, right? He deliberately tries to create this dramatic event where he's marching into the city, he goes to the temple, he cleans out all the people that were selling animals there. He creates a huge hubbub to the point where the whole city is like, who is this Jesus guy? What's going on? And it, for Jesus, was all building up to kind of forcing the people to make a choice. Well, they made the wrong choice. They decided to reject him. And then he goes into hiding in the last few days of Holy Week. And then he gets taken into, the whole crucifixion thing, which is, again, incredibly dramatic. And it's just surprising to me. It's surprising that everything, as soon as he dies, gets super, super dramatic again. All right? And the first thing I want to mention, even though it's the second thing the text mentions, is the earthquake, right? A major earthquake hits the entire city of Jerusalem, and they want to make sure you understand it's not just a little tremor, because it says not only did the earth shake, it says, but the rocks were split. The idea is there's like chasms opening up. There's like rocks that are slipping and sliding and falling, holes opening up in the ground. I imagine that everybody that was on their feet when the earthquake hit are now off their feet. They're like on their knees or on their face. They're on the ground watching everything shaking and all the rocks moving all around. I've been to Jerusalem. It's an incredibly rocky area. There's not a lot of precipitation that falls during the year, and so there's a lot of rocks to split open, okay? And I imagine that if you were on the hilltop that day watching Jesus, and the text tells us there was a big crowd that watched Jesus as he died. If you're on that hilltop and you see him breathe his last, and then all of a sudden, like 2 seconds after you see him make his final breath, all of a sudden everybody's on their face on the ground and the whole earth is shaking, what do you think you might conclude if you were there in that moment? Now, if you're a little bit superstitious, you might connect the earthquake to the death of that man who died on the cross, because he had big pretensions, didn't he? He made big claims about himself. He claimed not just to be a political leader, he claimed to be the Messiah, a spiritual figure as well as a political figure who was going to bring God's kingdom to earth. And so when he dies and then an instant later an earthquake coincidentally hits and knocks everybody off their feet, is it kind of like the coincidence that there was a solar eclipse that day from 12 to 3 o'clock, so they couldn't even see his final few hours, just hear his cries through the darkness? I imagine they had to find some torches and light them just to make sure everybody was where they were supposed to be. I mean, how much of a coincidence must that have felt like? You see, modern people, secular people like us, who are very used to naturalistic explanations for things, we might see that as just, wow, what a coincidence. I guarantee you the people that were on that hillside did not see it as a coincidence. They interpreted these events the way that the gospel writers want us to interpret them, as being a reaction immediately to the death of Jesus Christ. And I have a feeling if you're on that hilltop, whether you're friend or foe of Jesus, and you watch this earthquake knock everybody off their feet, you wonder if maybe there was something about this Jesus guy that you didn't quite expect, that maybe he was actually more than just a criminal, more than just a preacher, more than just a teacher. But the first detail, so that's the earthquake, that's the first thing, incredibly dramatic. I mean, and it was felt all over the city, whether you were out that night, like out at Calvary where Jesus is dying, or you're just at home in bed, waiting for the Sabbath to start, to have a Sabbath meal with your family, wherever you are. You felt that earthquake. It shook everything up. It knocked stuff over in your house, right? But the second event, and this one is one that only a few people probably witnessed, but I guarantee you a lot of people heard about later. It says the curtain of the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom. And the writer is very careful to say that this tearing happened exactly at the moment that Jesus died. So he breathes his last, and the curtain is ripped from top to bottom. Now, what is the deal with this curtain? What's going on in this curtain? Your homework for tonight is to go to Hebrews chapter 9, where it describes the purpose of this curtain. This curtain separated the inside of the temple into two main areas. The larger area was called the holy place, and all the priests every day would come in and they would do certain priestly duties in there. There's incense, there's bread that needs to be baked, believe it or not, and brought in there. There's things they have to do with oil and lamps and so on and so forth. That's all in what's called the holy place, where most priests could come in and do the work they had to do. But then there was this curtain. Really thick curtain, like 6 layers thick. And this 6 layers thick curtain separated the holy place from a much smaller place called the most holy place. And in this most holy place, what you have is you have the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark, if you go all the way back in the Old Testament, is the place where God's presence would meet with his people. And it would happen once a year on the Day of Atonement. And you could have one person, one day a year, could go behind that curtain, and that person better not come without some kind of a sacrifice. It had to be a blood sacrifice, and they would take the blood of a sacrifice and they would drip that blood on the altar for the purpose of covering over the sins of the people for another year. It was almost like God was doing like a lease plan with sins. And it was like 1 year at a time. And the priest, the high priest, would come in behind that curtain one time, and he would drip that blood on the altar, and God would accept that offering and decide not to punish the people for another year. And if the priest came again the next year, and the next year, and the next year, things were fine. If he didn't, that was bad. Now, suppose the priest decided he wanted to go back into the most holy place and just sort of check out the Ark of the Covenant. Just wanted to look at it because, they made a movie about it. Indiana Jones is pretty cool, and they just want to study it and see a little bit more about it. You open that curtain, the presence of the Lord would consume whoever did that. Why? Because the Ark of the Covenant represented God's presence. And because God is holy, God cannot be in the presence of sin. And so the curtain was there for the protection of the sinner, to keep the sinner from being burned up by the holiness of God. The curtain was a protection. So now that curtain that protected us from the presence of God that would burn us alive has been ripped in two. And it's not been ripped in two from the bottom to the top, which is if a human were going to rip it, he'd start at the bottom maybe and rip their way to the top. It's been ripped from the top to the bottom. So in other words, who did the ripping of this curtain? It was God himself. God ripped the curtain down. Why? Because they didn't need it anymore. Now, why didn't they need it anymore? Because Jesus, as God's high priest, had entered into the most holy place, having a blood sacrifice, and not just the blood of some animal, his own precious, perfect blood. And he had sprinkled his own blood on the altar of God's presence. And in that moment, the wrath of God for his people wasn't just covered over for another year, and then he'd have to come back next year and do it all over again. Now, the wrath of God over the sins of humanity as a whole has been satisfied forever. And it never has to be repeated. Jesus doesn't have to die ever again. One time was enough to pay the debt forever. And so now we don't need a curtain. Why? Because God's not angry anymore. God can look at us through the grid of Jesus, and he can have fellowship with us again. This is a fundamental, earth-shaking change in the way the people have been relating to God for thousands of years. And now that curtain has been torn in two. What a coincidence that it happened right at the moment Jesus died. You better believe, too, that all the priests who saw that curtain rip ran home and told somebody about it. And then they ran home and told somebody else about it. And I bet you that news was spreading through the city like wildfire. Nothing like this had ever happened before. And it was something that I'm sure drew a lot of attention because of how incredibly dramatic it was. Now, did they understand the significance and connect it to Jesus? No. But Matthew sure did. And I bet you there were people who followed Jesus who, when they heard that story, connected the dots and shared that with people. But then the third one, this is the one that's really weird, okay? And maybe you've never heard this before. Did you ever notice this verse 52 about the tombs being split open? Now, that would make sense, right? If you have tombs and there's a heavy earthquake and it breaks all the rocks in pieces, that some of the tombs maybe would get broken open and maybe some of the bodies would roll out or something. I don't know exactly how it would work. But you would expect that in a major disaster like that. But it's not just that. That's creepy enough. What the text tells us is that dead people, dead bodies of saints, or these are people that loved God and worshiped God from beforehand, we don't know how many years before, were raised to life and came out of the tombs. They pulled a Lazarus. They all got up and came out of the tomb. And then what did they do? Did they go up to heaven to be with God? No, they went into the holy city and appeared to many people. It seems like they've been raised from the dead on purpose to match and to announce the resurrection that's coming of Jesus Christ. Now that'd be weird, right? You're in your room, you're having your Sabbath meal, and then all of a sudden there's a knock at the window, and it's Grandma, who died like 20 years ago. And she's there in the flesh. Now, we don't know what they said, but my guess is that if God's going to raise them to dead and then send them in to meet with people in Jerusalem, they might have something to say about either what they've seen after they've been dead or about what just happened on a hillside outside the city in Calvary that they know about. My guess is that they bore witness about Jesus and his power and his death and the significance of it, and at least told a segment of the people in Jerusalem. Well, suppose there's 20 people that get these appearances from these dead people, and then the dead person disappears after a while or something. I don't know how that happened either. Do you think that might have circulated through the city? Do you think people started talking about it? Do you think the local gossip was filled with stories of dead people come back to life? And all of it, coincidentally enough, right, surrounds the death of this man who had claimed to be the Son of God. What a coincidence. Actually, not really, right? I think this is what I think. I think that in the days after Jesus' death and resurrection, 3 days on the third day, that the name of Jesus and all the stories around his death, I mean, everything from the supernatural darkness, the eclipse that happened, to the earthquake, to the veil of the temple, the curtain being ripped in two, to these dead people appearing to people throughout the city, I guarantee you that the name of Jesus and the stories about this remarkable man are on everybody's minds and in all of the city gossip for not just days. We're talking weeks, we're talking months. And I think God did it deliberately. God made it dramatic, and he made it as dramatic as he could possibly make it because he didn't want the people to forget this significant event that happened. And my guess is there's a lot of people who live in Jerusalem who hear all of this, and they probably reacted much like this centurion reacted, who said, as a Roman who has no idea what's going on, he goes, surely this man was the Son of God. In other words, they told us he was a criminal. They told us he was a liar. They told us he was a failed politician and preacher. But what he really was exactly what he claimed to be. And I bet that's circulating and rumbling through the background of the entire city of Jerusalem for weeks and weeks. And maybe, just maybe, they're thinking in the back of their heads, oh man, do you think that maybe we killed the Messiah? Do you think we made a horrible, horrible mistake? Now, 7 weeks after this event, there's another festival in the Jewish calendar called Pentecost. It takes place 50 days after Passover. On the 50th day, I should say, after Passover. And you may remember something pretty significant that happened on Pentecost 50 days after Jesus' death. Peter and the apostles and a group of about 120 disciples are all together in one place, and they're praying. And as they pray, they hear the sound of a noisy, violent, rushing wind. And there's flames of fire that appear in the room over each one of them. Does that sound pretty dramatic? Pretty impressive? And as soon as that happens, they start speaking in tongues, languages they've never learned before, and they're speaking the praises of God in all the languages of the world. And what do? They run out into the streets of Jerusalem, and they start, in all these different languages, start proclaiming the greatness and wonder of God and his son Jesus. And it draws a crowd, right? Because you got that many crazy people doing things you never expect, it draws a crowd. And then Peter preaches a sermon, and the punchline of Peter's sermon is, God sent us the Messiah, and you killed him. Now, what do you suppose the people of Jerusalem immediately start thinking about? They start thinking about a day when the sun went black. They start thinking about a day that an earthquake devastated the area. They start thinking about a day when the temple curtain gets ripped in two. They start thinking about the day that they started to have these visions of these people who had died long ago, who came back and bore witness about all this stuff. And they realize, oh my word, it's all true. This Jesus guy was who he claimed to be. And Peter's preaching brings all of that scuttlebutt and all of that rumor and innuendo and gossip into a moment of reality. Are you ever surprised that 3,000 people responded to Peter's message in 1 minute? Like, wouldn't you want time to think about this? Like, if you've never heard about Jesus and never heard about everything that's happening, and you go from being completely unaware and unconvinced to being completely convinced and looking at Peter and saying, Peter, what do I do? I think it makes perfect sense. The entire city was in an uproar for 50 days after Jesus died because of the dramatic events surrounding Jesus' death. So that when Peter finally comes and tells them what to do, they're just like, please help us out. What do we do with all this? We've been blown away by the drama that got attached to this event. Please help us out. 3,000 in 1 day respond. And the church is born. Now, friends, God is no stranger to tragedy. God is no stranger to things happening that seem pointless, just like Jesus' death. And there have been tragedies since. And God still worked in the middle of that tragedy, preparing people's hearts to respond to the message of Jesus. Friends, if he could do it then, why couldn't he do it now? And why couldn't he do it through us? Why couldn't he do it through us? You never know what ways God is preparing people's hearts to respond when you get the courage to speak to somebody. So speak to somebody. Talk to somebody about it. Invite them to know you, to know Jesus. Tell them the story. Help them connect the dots. And just watch as all of a sudden, sometimes people are going to be just ready to respond because God has brought them to that point of being ready, just like he did at Pentecost, just like he might do for us today. So my prayer for us, as we reflect on that, as we kind of think on our way towards Easter on Sunday and the resurrection of Jesus, is even after Jesus' death, God was moving to prepare people's hearts to respond to Jesus' message. God is still moving in the hearts of people, whether you see it or not. And if you have the courage to speak up, he might just use you to bring that back to their hearts and help them connect the dots. And then they'll turn to Jesus and be rescued. So that's what I want to think about. I want us to think about a little bit today. And I hope that's a challenge to you. And I hope it's an encouragement to you. Now let me really quick transition. Let me just talk to you about what we're going to do about communion this month. All right? And I want to tell you by saying I've really wrestled with this a lot. I know a lot of different churches are doing a lot of different things during this weird crisis where we're not able to gather together as we normally would. There's some churches that are having people celebrate at home in small groups. Other times they're kind of trying to stay connected and doing it together via live stream. Some people here, some people there. And then other churches are just choosing to wait and not celebrate until we're all back together. So we've thought a lot about this. We had a long conversation about it last night in our leadership meeting. And honestly, friends, reflecting on Scripture itself does not give us any clear indication of how often God expects us to celebrate communion. And so in some senses, I think that means we have freedom as a church to decide what is best for us in celebrating this very important practice that Jesus told us to celebrate. And it's important that we do communion honoring the values of communion, okay? And those values are, number one, the value of remembering Jesus, and number two, the value of remembering Jesus as a part of a community of people, as a part of a larger whole, to do it together. The fact that our common need and our common Savior doesn't just bind us to God, it binds us to one another. So we as a leadership team talked a lot about this and asked, how can we celebrate communion while still honoring the principles behind communion? And we think we can honor those values best by waiting until we are all able to gather together again to celebrate communion. We think that will most fully honor the value of not just connecting to God individually, but connecting to one another while we're connecting to him. So that means we're not going to have communion during the month of April. We have restrictions that we've decided upon until the end of the month. Now, when May rolls around, if the government starts to lift their restrictions and we can gather in a more complete way here together, we will probably re-examine all of this. If they extend those restrictions through the month of May, we'll probably have to reevaluate again. But for now, the month of April, we've decided to not celebrate communion and wait to honor the Lord and honor the values behind communion by celebrating when we're all together. So that's what we're planning to do for now. And May will roll around and we'll update our thoughts and we'll get back to you on that. Just want to give a couple quick announcements and then I'll be done. I'll be putting another worship song recommendation on Facebook today. Be looking for that a little bit later this afternoon. I hope it's a blessing to you. I really enjoy listening to these songs, especially when we can't sing all together. And maybe this will give you a small taste of worship even when we're not together. Secondly, I wanted to remind you, we have a few kits if you want to make some masks to give and donate to Arnott Medical Center. We have a few kits here left, not a lot, but we have a few left. If you want to come pick one up, make a few kits, make a few masks, we'll be collecting those again from you and then delivering them to the hospital very soon so that they can use them. Also, throughout the month of April, we're collecting money for Samaritan's Purse to help them with the expenses that they're incurring from having the field hospital in Central Park in New York City treating COVID-19 victims. We heavily encourage you to donate to this throughout the rest of the month of April. We'll collect it all, and we'll try to give you a good update as well on how much we've been collecting once the month wraps up. And really, other than that, I'll see you again here tomorrow at 4 o'clock. We're going to have another post-crucifixion meditation tomorrow before we turn our thoughts on Sunday to the resurrection. May the Lord bless you. Thanks for joining me, and we will see you again tomorrow at 4 o'clock.